The Memories Thief. Living in the Shadows of War-Torn Lives. Written by Sabin Bogdan Codarcea. Author thoughts. As more time passes from an event, are we more or less prone to repeat it? This question holds particular weight in our times, as the world reflects on the haunting lessons of the First and Second World Wars. We often hear politicians proclaim "never again," as though a phrase alone could insulate us from history's recurring tragedies. Yet, these are often the very people who lay the groundwork for similar crises, slowly weaving narratives of national defense, liberation, and heroism, casting us as the righteous while they are painted as the villains. As time stretches on, fewer factors seem to be required to reignite similar events. Major historical catastrophes stem from a series of causes: economic pressures, territorial disputes, resource shortages, religious divides, and so on. When a war or other such tragedy finally ends, the collective scars are fresh, and a cooling period follows in which society is often vigilant against a repetition. In these immediate years, it would take a significant combination of forces to reawaken a similar calamity. However, as decades pass, the lessons fade, the emotional weight of memories dulls, and with it, the resistance to these events weakens. In time, fewer factors are needed to ignite the same flames. A generation too distant from the horrors becomes more susceptible to the idealized versions of the past, allowing propaganda to twist history into stories of heroism and noble conquest. The atrocities become abstract, the victims faceless, and the rhetoric of righteousness dangerously seductive. We must consider, then, not just the question of time and repetition, but how we guard the memory of these events against distortion. How can we ensure that the tragedies of our ancestors do not become the fantasies of future generations? The duty of remembrance should be more than ceremonial; it must be a vigilant, uncomfortable engagement with our past, a refusal to let collective amnesia pave the way for history to repeat itself. This erosion of collective memory is perhaps one of the most dangerous cycles of history. It is a slow amnesia, one that may lead us, knowingly or unknowingly, down the same paths our ancestors once walked, paths paved with destruction and sorrow. And so, it falls upon us to resist the pull of this amnesia, to remember not only the glories, but the suffering, and to pass down the truth untouched by fantasy. For if we are to truly avoid repeating the past, we must be vigilant keepers of memory, refusing to let time and distance dilute the lessons left behind. The book is trying to raise awareness about the implications of the wars, not only during the event itself, but also in the years to follow, which can raise to the same level of horrors as the ones brought by the war. In the case of this story, one of the horrors is the paranoia created by the communist system through the continuous spying of the close ones, and feeling a pressure of giving some information about someone, raising suspicions even about the smallest activity. An interesting part of this is that while feeling a pressure from the ones giving the orders, people tend to think that anyone can be a possible enemy of the state except the ones giving the orders. The book's main inspirations come from two main sources, each deeply personal and hauntingly resonant. The first one is a family connection that stayed with me through the years. I learned that my great-grandfather and his family left Poland for Romania before the start of the Second World War. When the war began, he and his younger brother were enlisted in the Romanian army, but he was sent back because he wasn't considered Romanian, having been born in Poland. His younger brother remained in the army and was killed on the front. This story, of fate, of nationality, and of the arbitrary nature of identity in times of war, served as a guiding memory in writing this book, which I dedicate to their lives and the memory of those turbulent times. The second source, which left a profound impact on the book's themes, is the movie Come and See It by Elem Klimov. This movie left perhaps the deepest mark on me, as it has on many others. To understand the quality of the movie and the impact it can have, it is enough to see endless reviews of the movie giving it perfect scores, 10 tenths, 5 stars, often accompanied by words like terrifying and horrific, with viewers saying they'll never watch it again. If there's ever been a movie so good but so impactful that you'll never want to revisit it, Come and See is that movie. The raw, unflinching depiction of war's psychological devastation profoundly shaped the mood and tone of my story. You might notice that the ending of Chapter 6 has several references to the closing scenes of Klimov's movie, a tribute to its visceral exploration of the human soul under siege. One choice that may stand out is the absence of a name for the protagonist. This was entirely intentional. While the story unfolds from his perspective, the true main character here is the world he inhabits, a world of forces far beyond his control. In life, we often give ourselves so much importance, convinced we are the main players. But in reality, we're actors on a stage vastly greater than ourselves, influenced by countless factors that shape us, whether we're aware of it or not. In this way, the protagonist could represent any of those who fought on the front lines, who returned home to a place they once knew, only to find it transformed, shattered by a world reeling from war's aftermath. This story reflects that stark reality of men and women left to navigate a post-war world filled with remnants of the past, where life is no longer about living but about adapting and surviving, with each person's essence shaped by forces beyond their choosing. This book is a tribute to them, a reminder of the unseen weight they bore, and a caution about the fragile line between ourselves and the world that shapes us. The Memories Thief. Chapter 1. July 1942. The rain was relentless. It beat against the canvas cover of the military truck like a drummer in a nervous trance. For 2 days and nights, the rumble of the engine and the crazy rhythm of the downpour became our world, only interrupted when we stopped to refuel or were handed some modest rations to keep us going. Tonight, the air felt more like a damp October than July, fitting, I thought, for the clouded heaviness sitting in our hearts. Across from me sat my older brother, Augustine. In the dim, shifting light, his face looked worn and distant, as though already carrying the weight of battles not yet fought. The country's spirit had been high just weeks ago when Romania joined the war, convinced that the moment was ripe to reclaim Bessarabia, the fractured piece of land we'd lost to the Soviet Union in 1940. Many believed that joining the war now was an act of retribution, something honorable. But Augustine and I had read enough, perhaps too much. Books on war had warned us of the toll it exacted, even on the victors. We knew that no one walked away from war without leaving pieces of themselves behind, scattered, abandoned, or scarred. Yet, for the entire journey, neither of us spoke of our fears. I often wanted to meet his gaze, to draw some strength or even sympathy from his expression, but instead, we kept our exchanges brief, almost forced. A few clipped jokes or offhand comments, but always avoiding the words that might allow the dread to rise to the surface. There was a crushing silence in the truck, one that swallowed any feeling or identity we'd once had. Now, we were just bodies, bound for an uncertain destiny, where a captain's command determined our every step. Every so often, the silence would be broken by Bogdan. He seemed untouched by the weight that pinned the rest of us down. He'd sing under his breath or crack jokes, his laughter cutting through the tense quiet like a blade. He'd always been this way, irrepressible and defiant in his own peculiar manner. He was also my closest friend. We'd grown up together in Sechesti, a small village where we knew every path and field, and later we had made our way to Bucharest to study, full of hope and plans. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. Both of us were called to military training, and 3 days ago, we were bound for the front. Even his jokes couldn't dispel the weight entirely. For us, it was as though we'd all become shadows of ourselves, faceless figures swallowed by the machinery of war, each step forward a reminder that we were no longer in control of our fates. Hoting lay ahead, our truck's final destination. Word had it we were to merge with the 3rd Romanian Army, which had been pushing eastward in the offensive. On the night of July 10th, we finally rolled into the town. Just 2 days earlier, it had been taken from enemy control, and now it bore the marks of both recent battle and occupation. The streets were littered with remnants of a town caught between worlds. Soldiers moved like shadows through its alleys, their faces set in hardened expressions that betrayed no hint of victory, only exhaustion. The truck barely ground to a halt before we were being assigned to our roles, as though every second held the weight of an hour. Augustine and Bogdan were taken almost immediately to the front. Their bravery and skill had drawn attention during training, earning them this grim privilege. I remember catching a final glimpse of Augustine's face before he disappeared into the ranks. His eyes were resolute, but I could see the flicker of doubt behind his determined stare, a silent question, a private fear. I, however, was led in a different direction. The captain's words echoed in my mind as he relayed my orders. I was to report to the major immediately. They needed someone who could handle both written and verbal communication, he explained briskly. It was a strange, anticlimactic task, a respite in a war with no guarantees. But then he mentioned the previous soldier, the one whose role I was to assume. A shiver passed through me as he added, almost as an afterthought, that the young man had been killed just a day ago, shot while delivering a message between divisions. In that instant, my relief at being spared the front faded, replaced by a cold dread. There was no safe place here, no sanctuary. Death hovered over every role, whether on the front lines or in the back ranks, and each of us had simply become another piece of the army's machinery, destined to break or wear down in time. The insignificance of rank or assignment was humbling. With one order, our fates were laid bare, and all that remained was the haunting realization of how little control we had over what would come. As the weeks bled into months, I found myself edging ever closer to the front. The command had shifted me to assist divisions struggling with communication. Most of their equipment was worn, and many of their men were untrained in its proper use. It was a grim irony, I thought, that my education had brought me closer to danger rather than insulating me from it. And yet, somehow, I survived. Looking back, I still cannot say what shielded me, some strange fortune, or, perhaps, though it pains me to admit, my own cowardice. When the shells began to fall, my instincts would seize me completely. I remember countless times standing rooted to the ground, my entire body paralyzed as if I'd become one with the earth itself. Seconds ticked by, each an eternity, until the smoke cleared and I'd awaken, shaken yet unharmed. In those surreal, breathless moments, images of what could have been would flood my mind. Each time, I'd see myself struck down by an artillery blast, limbs shattered, consciousness fading. It was impossible to decide if I was fortunate or cursed to remain unscathed. I felt adrift in a war that seemed endless, with nothing but the certainty of death ever approaching, and the haunting question of why it had not yet claimed me. And then, a thought would surge up, like a lifeline through the fog. Augustine and Bogdan, my brother and my closest friend, both out there on the front lines, both living each day in far graver danger. Each message I carried, each order I relayed might be the very thing that kept them alive another hour, another day. This belief became my anchor, my only refuge against the darkness creeping into my mind. The mere hope that I could shield them, even at a distance, was enough to bury the madness brewing within me. Holding fast to this purpose, I managed to push through, though I sometimes feared I'd forgotten what it felt like to be truly alive. Reflecting on it now, I often think it might have been a mercy if it had all ended during those early months on the front. War felt like the pinnacle of human suffering, the absolute worst of what we were capable of. And yet, I was about to learn that there existed an even more insidious battleground, a place within, where the most merciless wars and powerful enemies lay in wait. It was a rare, quiet evening when I was summoned by the captain. I reported as instructed, and he informed me of a new mission. I was to deliver 2 radio units to a division station just past a nearby village. He allowed me to select 2 men to accompany me. The choice was immediate, instinctive. Without a moment's hesitation, I requested Augustine and Bogdan. I knew they were stationed nearby, and the thought of seeing them again, even briefly, felt like a blessing. I reassured myself that the mission would be straightforward, a quick crossing through a village already secured by our forces and a simple delivery to the division positioned at the edge of a forest. Within the hour, both Augustine and Bogdan had arrived. Our reunion, even under these grim circumstances, filled me with a strange warmth I hadn't felt in what seemed like an eternity. It was as if, for a fleeting moment, we were back in Sechesti, 3 young men in a world untouched by war. We each bore new scars, some visible, while some invisible yet heavy, and each of us seemed slightly foreign to each other, as if we had been reshaped in different ways by the months apart. Yet, seeing them still breathing, still standing after all they'd endured, stirred a fragile hope in me. Maybe, just maybe, this was proof that we might actually survive, that there could be an end to the madness, and that we might one day return home. We set off with a quiet determination, the glances we exchanged heavy with all the words we'd left unspoken. But beneath my relief and joy simmered a faint, unshakable unease, a sense that this reunion, however precious, would be brief, a fragile beacon in the storm that was yet to come. The feeling of unease I'd had was more than just a passing shadow. It was as though some part of me knew that we were about to step into something darker. As we entered the village at midnight, an eerie silence hung in the air, its darkness impenetrable, broken only by the distant echoes of artillery and gunfire. This place, which was supposed to be under Romanian control, bore no signs of our army or even the enemy's. Instead, it felt deserted, an empty shell of a village, with the bodies of civilians scattered across the streets, remnants of a fierce battle still fresh. We moved cautiously, covering nearly half of the village without encountering a single soul. The sounds of fighting grew louder, an ominous backdrop to our journey. As we stopped briefly by a fountain to fill our canteens, we heard a rustling from the nearby house. Instinctively, we took cover, our hands tight on our rifles. A man's voice broke the silence, speaking softly in Romanian. He said he'd heard us speaking in his native tongue and introduced himself as part of a small Romanian community living in the village. Then, almost as an afterthought, he pleaded for help, explaining that one of his children had been wounded in the earlier fighting. Bogdan volunteered without hesitation, saying he had a few bandages and might be able to help the family. He hoped, too, to learn more about what had happened here. We watched as he entered the house, while Augustine and I finished filling our canteens, planning to join him shortly. But seconds after Bogdan crossed the threshold, chaos erupted. Gunshots cracked through the darkness, shattering the tense quiet, and artillery shells exploded, tearing through two houses nearby. I threw myself behind the fountain, breathless, while Augustine, with astonishing calm, barely took cover. I could only watch in awe as he picked off 3 enemy soldiers within moments, his skill so precise it was as if he were untouched by fear. Then he turned to me, his voice firm but carrying a rare tenderness. "I know you're scared," he said. "But we won't get out of this alive unless you help me." His words pulled me from my paralysis. My heart pounded as I gripped my rifle, my mind racing with the knowledge that I hadn't fired a single shot in all these months, hadn't hurt a soul, but Augustine's steady gaze left no room for doubt or hesitation. This was survival. Pushing through my fear, I bolted to a crumbling wall near the fountain, crouching low as I scanned the shadows. I called out to Augustine, saying I'd guard the side near the house where Bogdan had entered, and then, as if summoned by fate, I spotted movement, a shadow taking cover behind the building's corner. I aimed at the edge of the wall, waiting. Augustine cleared the other side, but he kept his guard up, cautiously covering his side as well. Time blurred, each second both stretching and collapsing. I couldn't tell if I was breathing, but I felt the tremble in my hand as I held my rifle aimed. A thought flitted through my mind, I hoped whoever it was had left, that I wouldn't need to pull the trigger. But before I could consider any alternative, a figure darted from the corner. Reflex took over. My finger squeezed the trigger, and in a jolt of sound and recoil, I watched as the man fell. I staggered out from behind the wall, glancing at Augustine as he stepped forward, his rifle still ready. A shot rang out from his side, and I felt a strange confusion, as if something fundamental had shifted out of place. I had been certain there was only one figure left, so why did Augustine just fired, and why am I just seeing another body dropping on the ground close to the one I just shot? A wave of dread washed over me, filling me with a hollow, desperate panic. Without thinking, I ran toward the figure I'd shot, stumbling over the uneven ground. The lack of light around me should have been a comfort, a cloak to hide what I feared to see. But there was no escaping what lay before me. As I knelt down, my mind seized on a single realization, a truth I could not unsee, a horror I could not undo. Augustine approached, his expression slowly shifting as he understood. I felt my throat tighten, and suddenly, the words burst out of me in a choked, helpless sob. No. 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 What have I done? Augustine knelt beside me, his face a mask of grief and determination as he kept scanning the area, rifle at the ready. He said nothing as I wept, overcome by the weight of what I had done, my mind reeling in the silence that followed. The war outside was nothing compared to the battle now raging inside my heart, a battle I knew I would carry with me for the rest of my days. For months, I'd survived the deadliest stretches of the front, dodging artillery shells that fell like rain, bullets that took down the men beside me, even one that pierced straight through my water canteen. I had felt, in some twisted way, invincible, as though all the near misses were evidence of some special fate. But now, clutching Bogdan's lifeless body, I realized that all those brushes with death had simply been leading to this catastrophe, a horror for which I was utterly unprepared. How could it be that in over 6 months, I never fired my rifle, and when I finally did, my single shot found the heart of my best friend? The bullet struck true, and his body crumpled instantly to the ground. I held him, feeling consciousness fading rapidly. Even now, I struggle to recall what followed. It's not so much that I've forgotten, but that I never truly knew. Snatches of memory flicker, artillery blasts, Augustine pulling me from the dirt, the wounded family with their child, and a long, disoriented march back toward our destination. But all of it is dim, murky, my mind always returning to the last thing I saw of Bogdan, his eyes, once warm brown with a thin ring of green at the bottom, now fixed, blackened, drained of life. By morning, we returned to our divisions. Our army had since regained control of the village. I remember a desperate search for Bogdan's body. The house and the entire area around it had been reduced to rubble by relentless shelling, nothing remained. For days, I wandered like a ghost, driven by orders alone, unable to think for myself. During an intense barrage, I was caught in another explosion, this one leaving me temporarily blinded in my left eye. The field doctor wrapped a crew patch around it, saying the damage might heal in time but that I would need rest. It was only days later, with my vision still half clouded, that I was called into the major's improvised office. I could feel his eyes on me, studying the wreck I'd become. After a moment's silence, he told me that I was being dismissed and would be sent back home. My mind raced. I assumed it was because of my injury. But then he added, as if explaining to a child, that it wasn't only my eye, but that you're not really one of us. He went on to explain that I wasn't truly Romanian, that suspicions could be raised. The words struck like blows. It was true, I'd been born in Poland, my family moving to Romania when I was young, where Augustine was born. But I'd lived here most of my life. I'd fought for this country. How could that possibly matter now? The major had no intention of debating. He informed me I would be departing with the next supply truck in under an hour, leaving me far from the front lines, where I would need to make my way back to Romania on my own. In desperation, I begged him to let me stay, or at least allow me to speak to Augustine. But he refused. There was no time for sentimentality. Within minutes, I was packed into a truck, being refused even the chance of seeing for a moment Augustine, and his image haunted me more and more for every extra mile that separated us. Months passed, and the memory of that night gnawed at me. Then, in November of 1942, I learned of Augustine's death at Stalingrad. With trembling hands, I read letter after letter from men who had served alongside him, men who had escaped that brutal front and made their way home. From their stories, a truth emerged, one I'd never imagined. Augustine, it seemed, had bribed the major to send me away, to send me home. It was his way of ensuring my survival, his last gift to me. He had sacrificed everything to pull me out of that hell, knowing full well the risks he faced. If only he'd known that he had saved the wrong brother. Chapter 2: The Long Road to Nowhere. The journey home stretched on, a week of endless stops and starts, leaping from one truck to another, each ride pushing me closer to the place I both longed for and dreaded. The entire focus of the army was directed forward, funneling supplies and soldiers toward the front, and returning men like me were scarcely noticed, a burden to be passed along until we reached the back lines. Sometimes, I even let trucks pass intentionally, choosing to lay low in yet another unknown town or roadside ditch, waiting in silence rather than moving on. I felt suspended, as if each mile toward home asked me to confront memories I could hardly bear to think about, let alone face. It was strange, almost comforting, to feel lost in unfamiliar surroundings. Being lost here, far from familiar faces and responsibilities, seemed safer somehow, the world outside barely intruding upon the turmoil inside. At home, life would go on, time would stretch out, demanding I pick up my shattered self and continue. But here, on this winding, aimless journey, I could carry the weight of my pain as though it were a travel companion, close, yet quiet, needing no answers. The road felt like a pause between two worlds. Here, among the dirt paths and nameless villages, I could move through each day numb, untouched by expectations. The moment I arrived home, I knew the real battle would begin. I'd have to stare down the agony of loss, drawing it in until it became part of me. Perhaps I'd find the strength to go forward, to weave it into my life and keep moving. Or maybe it would overwhelm me, eroding my mind and spirit until there was nothing left to carry on. Finally, I arrived in Bucharest. It had been a week since I'd left the front, but each day on the road had felt like an eternity, stretching further from my past and yet somehow drawing me deeper into its shadows. It was the dead of night when I reached the city, and the streets were cloaked in darkness, the lights dimmed as if the city itself were holding its breath, fearful of drawing unwanted eyes from above. As I moved through the empty streets, I felt like a ghost drifting through the town, unseen, unwanted, barely tethered to the life I'd once known. I could have gone to my parents' house, knocked on their door, and seen their faces light up with relief to know I was safe. They would have held me close, showered me with all the love and care I had been deprived of for so long. But loneliness, I had come to realize, asks no questions. It does not demand answers we're not ready to face. And so, I avoided them. Instead, I kept to the shadows, slipping silently through the streets, unwilling to announce my return to anyone who might care. I finally reached the apartment I'd once shared with Bogdan, moving as quietly as possible to avoid attracting the attention of any neighbors. I stepped inside, and the silence of the empty rooms felt like a cold hand gripping my chest. The air was thick with memories, yet utterly devoid of the life we'd filled it with. I sank to the floor, too weary to find the bed, and lay there in the darkness, unmoving. The hours drifted by without me marking them. I made no sound, took no food or water, as if denying my own presence might somehow erase the agony that pulsed beneath it all. Each night, I crept out to wander the city's quiet streets, choosing paths through neighborhoods where no one would recognize me, avoiding the places we'd once frequented together. The only sounds were my own footsteps, echoing faintly in the stillness. By day, I lay again on the floor, my gaze fixed on some unseen point, my mind hollow, numb. It was as if time had stopped, as if the walls around me had become my only shield against the world outside, a world I was no longer sure how to belong to. I wandered the streets for 2 days, restless and haunted, avoiding the apartment because I knew my mother would come to check on it, as she did each Saturday since I'd left. Rain poured down endlessly, drenching me as I moved aimlessly through the city, hiding from anything familiar. By the time I finally returned, exhaustion had pulled me to my limits, and all I wanted was sleep, the cold numbness of unconsciousness. I hoped that in my absence, my mother had found nothing amiss, no sign of my return. I'd been so careful, barely touching anything but the door and the floor, as if leaving the apartment untouched might keep the memories at bay. When I slipped inside that night, the lights were off, and everything lay in shadows. I shut the door quietly, but as I stepped forward, I noticed a letter lying on the floor. I picked it up, dropped to the floor, and lay back against the wall as I opened it. Only then did I realize I hadn't checked if it was meant for me. But by the time that thought crossed my mind, my eyes were already moving over the words, and with each line, my chest tightened, my breathing shallow. The letter was from Ekaterina, Bogdan's girlfriend. She lived in another town, and it seemed she had been writing to him, sending letters she hoped he'd read when he returned. My mother must have missed this one on her visit, likely tucking away the rest somewhere in his room, preserving them like relics of a life that was supposed to have continued. The words tore into me as she spoke of her hope, of how she couldn't wait to see him, of the news she had to share, that soon he'd be a father. Her words, so full of life and expectation, broke through my defenses, and the tears came, heavy and unstoppable. I pressed my back against the wall, crushed by a despair I hadn't thought possible. The war hadn't prepared me for this, nor for the truth I now carried, which felt like a weight that would never lift. I couldn't escape the horrible irony of it all, that the same fear that had kept me alive in the war, my inability to face death, now kept me tethered to a life that felt unendurable. I didn't have the courage to end it, even though what lay ahead seemed like a punishment that no soul should have to bear. Sleep took me eventually, numbing me to everything. By morning, a faint clarity returned, like the thinnest crack of light breaking through. I knew what I had to do. I couldn't leave her in the dark, not after reading her words. She had to know the truth, however fractured and painful. There was no escaping it. And perhaps, I thought, sharing this burden might make it easier to carry. Maybe we could find some way through it together. With what little money I had, I took the first train to her town, my mind clouded with dread and an endless loop of memories. But as the train rattled on, I felt my resolve waver. I tried to recall every detail of that night. But the pain twisted the memory, my mind pushing away the most unbearable parts, the shot, the finality of it all, my responsibility in it. By the time I arrived, the truth felt less like fact and more like fragments, fractured pieces of a reality my mind was trying to bury. Yet here I was, standing in her town with nothing but the blurred memories and the unbearable truth I had to share. I had always considered myself, if not a good man, then at least a decent one. In the days since leaving the front, my mind clung to the reminder that what happened had been an accident, a mistake born of chaos and confusion. Yet, how could I possibly explain that to anyone else when even I had to keep reminding myself? This kind of tragic error wasn't unique, I'd heard of many such incidents during my time on the front. But that knowledge did little to soothe me. I was the one who had pulled the trigger, and now I stood outside the door of the woman who'd loved him, heart pounding as I raised my hand to knock. As soon as my knuckles touched the wood, I stepped back, hoping desperately that no one would answer. But within seconds, the door opened. I froze. I hadn't been quick enough to escape, and there she stood, Ekaterina. For a fleeting moment, her face lit up with a look of recognition and hope, as if my presence might mean good news, as if I were there to tell her that Bogdan would be coming home soon. The weight of her expectation bore down on me, making it nearly impossible to stand. The light in her eyes seemed to pierce straight through me, a painful reminder of the hope I was about to extinguish. I felt like a thief, poised to rob her of the very thing keeping her spirit alive. My mouth opened to speak, but no words came. The truth I'd traveled all this way to deliver felt like a betrayal, yet there was no turning back. I'd come to offer her the truth, even if it was the last thing she wanted to hear. I struggled to find a way to begin, knowing that whatever I said next would shatter that fragile light I saw in her eyes. Her questions came fast, one after another, words spilling out in a desperate stream as she searched my face for answers. At first, I tried to hold her gaze, but my silence weighed heavily, and soon she began to falter. Her words slowed, her voice lowering, as the initial spark of hope shifted into an uneasy quiet. I saw the realization flicker in her eyes, a faint glimmer that grew into something darker and more painful until it culminated in a single, piercing cry, "Tell me." The shout shattered whatever defenses I had left, and the truth broke free, tumbling from my mouth in fragments. My words were a jumbled mix of facts and raw emotion, each one barely making sense to me, but I managed to convey the essential truth, that he had been shot, that he wasn't coming back, but nothing about who killed him or how. As the words reached her, her body seemed to crumple, and she nearly collapsed. I caught her, helping her to sit at the small kitchen table. She buried her face in her crossed arms, hiding from a reality that was now inescapable. I sat across from her, watching as her shoulders shook with silent sobs. My own tears began to fall, blending with the profound release that came from finally voicing the truth I'd carried for so long. It was a relief tainted by guilt and loss, a release that brought no comfort, only the sense that I'd at last unburdened myself of this tragic confession, even if it left us both broken in its wake. I don't know how long we sat there, locked in that silence. Time felt warped, as if the seconds had stretched into hours, days, or even years. It was as though we were trapped, bound to that moment by the weight of our grief. A surge of anger bubbled within me, anger at the world and its relentless demand for movement, for adaptation, as if it had no patience or empathy for our suffering. There's never a chance to catch your breath, no space to simply exist in pain. This world demands constant forward motion, and sometimes, I don't know if that's its worst flaw or its saving grace. Minutes passed. Ekaterina kept her head down, silent except for her quiet sobs. My mind drifted, and then, almost imperceptibly, a sharp pain sparked in my left eye. It started as a dull ache beneath the patch I was supposed to keep on for another week, but within moments, it became an unbearable, searing pain. Unable to bear it, I staggered up and turned toward a mirror on the kitchen wall. With trembling fingers, I lifted the patch, bracing myself for what I might see. What I found made my heart pound with disbelief. My left eye, once a clear green, had somehow turned a warm brown, a color impossible, foreign, but disturbingly familiar. I stared, uncomprehending, into the mirror, struggling to process what I was seeing, trying to convince myself it was a trick of the light, a sign of madness overtaking me. In a frantic attempt to ground myself, I scanned the room, looked back at the mirror, and then I noticed it. There, at the bottom of my altered eye, was a thin ring of green, identical to the one in Bogdan's. A scream shattered the silence, and I turned to see Ekaterina staring at me, her eyes wide with horror. Her face twisted in fury and grief, and she pointed, her voice rising into a scream. "You killed him! You did it! You have his eye!" She lunged at me, fists flying, her accusations striking as sharply as her blows. I stammered, trying to explain, to deny what I could barely understand myself, but my words fell on deaf ears. Her grief had turned to rage, and all I could do was raise my hands to shield myself, her cries ringing in my ears, each word a blade. I felt in an impossible situation to defend myself, so the only option I had was to run, and that's exactly what I did, opening the door of her apartment and running down the stairs, while she screamed from the bottom of her lungs that I killed him, and I could hear her neighbors opening the doors one by one trying to find out what happened. I ran out of the building and did not stop for minutes, until I arrived in a nearby park, gasping for breath, my heart still pounding with fear and confusion. Hand shaking, I pulled the patch back over my eye, as if that would somehow restore my sanity, as if it would erase what I'd seen. My mind spun, grappling with the impossible reality of it. How could this be? How could my eye? The question hung in the air, unanswered, haunting me as I sat beneath that tree, staring into the darkness, more lost than ever. Even after covering my eye, the pain persisted, sharp and relentless, just as it had been in Ekaterina's apartment. As I began to catch my breath, it intensified rapidly, until everything went black. When I opened my eyes again, I found myself in a bed I didn't recognize, in a room that somehow felt familiar. I stared at the door, which was cracked open, allowing a thin line of light to seep in. I noticed it was night outside, the dim glow of a street lamp filtering through a window. My mind spun, and then I heard footsteps. Moments later, the door opened slowly, and someone flipped on the lights. I blinked, squinting against the brightness, and with a jolt, I realized where I was, Bogdan's room, in his parents' apartment. My heart sank as I tried to comprehend how I'd ended up here, of all places, when the last thing I remembered was collapsing in the park. His parents were now staring at me, expressions of concern etched on their faces as they asked how I was feeling. I mumbled that I felt a bit better, all the while wondering how I could have wandered here in my unconscious state, placing myself in yet another impossible situation. They suggested we go to the kitchen, have some tea and food, and talk. I accepted, hoping it would buy me time to decide if I had the strength to tell them the truth, knowing it would be another brutal confession in the same day. But as I sat at the table, trying to gather myself, it quickly became clear that avoiding the truth was impossible. They spoke of Bogdan with such hope, clearly desperate for any news about him. With each question, I felt myself sinking further. I could feel them waiting, searching my face for answers, for reassurance. At last, I simply began. I told them that Bogdan had been shot, that he was gone. But the details, the awful truth of how it happened, I kept those to myself, burying them as deeply as I could. Ekaterina's accusations rang in my mind. "You killed him," she'd said, her words laced with rage. It was as if her anger had branded me, making me realize that explaining it as a mistake would change nothing. No one would accept it as an accident. And so, I sat there, only half present, my mind hazy and detached, as though some part of me were slipping away. I reached for the tea and began to eat, numbly going through the motions while Bogdan's parents crumbled in front of me, their cries filling the room. It felt surreal, a strange, twisted cycle of despair and confusion punctuated by an indifferent need to finish my meal. They had so few questions after I told them the truth, perhaps too shocked to process it all, and I could feel the silence closing in, swallowing all of us whole. After a few minutes, I excused myself, claiming I needed to leave. They insisted I stay the night, but I declined, every fiber of my being telling me I couldn't remain there a moment longer. I slipped out of their apartment as quickly as I could, with all three of us lost in the void of grief and confusion, each too uncertain of how to face the other. As I left, a part of me wished I could have stayed, to share in their sorrow, to somehow ease the weight of my guilt. But all I could do was keep moving, drifting from one unbearable truth to the next, knowing that the comfort of familiar faces would offer me no refuge. After everything that happened in that day, I felt like it was time to visit my own parents. The thought of seeing them, of offering some relief in the form of good news, felt like it might grant me a brief moment of peace. The strange fact of how I'd ended up in Bogdan's parents' apartment still weighed on my mind, but I pushed it aside, figuring the long train ride back to Bucharest would give me ample time to try to make sense of it. I headed to the train station, already rehearsing what I might say to my parents, hoping the familiarity would provide some small comfort. As I reached into my pocket to count what little money I had left, my fingers brushed against something unexpected, a cool, circular metal object. Frowning, I pulled it out, and my heart skipped a beat. In my hand lay a beautiful gold ring. It caught the dim light, glinting with a warm glow, and as I turned it over, I noticed an inscription engraved on the inside, Ekaterina. For a few moments, I was paralyzed, staring at the ring in shock. My mind raced with questions. How could this ring, Ekaterina's ring, be in my possession? I hadn't seen it before, nor would I have known where Bogdan kept it. The idea that I might have stolen it, unconsciously or otherwise, was both absurd and terrifying. I quickly shoved it back into my pocket, glancing around to see if anyone had noticed my strange discovery. Feeling the weight of the ring pressing against my palm, I hurried outside the station, needing air and space to think. There was no logical way I could have obtained this ring without taking it from Bogdan's parents' home. But why would I do that? My mind swirled with countless possibilities, none of them satisfying or clear. As confusion gave way to a sort of numb clarity, I realized I only had one option for what to do next: return it to Ekaterina. It felt imperative, as though leaving her without it would add yet another burden to my already heavy conscience. Yet, after our last encounter, I couldn't bring myself to knock on her door again. Instead, I slipped the ring into a plain envelope, unmarked, and waited nearby until late into the night. Finally, under cover of darkness, I approached her apartment and slid the envelope under her door, hoping she'd find it in the morning and that the ring would, in some way, bring her a measure of comfort. With the envelope delivered, I returned to the train station, waiting out the remaining hours of night before taking the first train back to Bucharest. Exhaustion settled over me as I slumped into a seat, watching the darkness give way to dawn, the ring's mystery haunting me with each mile. Chapter 3. Where are the heroes? After arriving in Bucharest, I finally made my way to my parents' home. I could write an entire book on their happiness when they saw me standing in the doorway, safe and whole, and how their joy doubled when I told them that my brother was still alive, out there somewhere. They held on to the hope that he, too, would one day return. I told them I had just come back from the front that very day, omitting the harrowing encounters with Ekaterina and Bogdan's parents. There was no place here for that part of my story, not yet. Of course, I couldn't avoid telling them about Bogdan's death, but each time I mentioned it without revealing the whole truth, it became strangely easier. It was as if, with each telling, the details of how it happened became less vivid in my mind. The accident, the tragic mistake, it all blurred in a way that made the pain softer, easier to bear. As I told the story, I realized that perhaps it wasn't fear of others judging me that made me withhold the truth, but rather my own inability to forgive myself, to accept that what happened was truly an accident. And yet, as I repeated the same partial truth, I noticed how it became easier and easier to ignore the deeper, graver details. I found myself clinging to the comforting lie, each retelling like a layer of dust covering the pain. They say if you repeat a lie often enough, even you start to believe it. I could feel that process starting within me, a slow shift, as if the memory were turning into something faded, less real. But as I settled back into the rhythm of life at my parents' home, I began to realize that my unease wasn't just about Bogdan or that single, terrible moment. Something deeper gnawed at me, something I couldn't shake, even in the warmth and familiarity of my family's embrace. It took a month for this awareness to fully surface, but in that time, I began to understand that the heaviness I carried wasn't rooted solely in Bogdan's death, but in the entire experience of war. The violence, the fear, the relentless chaos, these had changed something fundamental within me. I realized that my memories, my grief, and my guilt were all woven together, tangled into a web I'd struggled to untangle. I decided to stay with my parents, at least for the time being. Returning to the apartment I'd once shared with Bogdan would only reopen wounds that were barely starting to close. But even in my parents' home, I couldn't escape the strange pull that seemed to drag me back toward him. For the next month, I found myself slipping in and out of consciousness, only to wake up disoriented lying on Bogdan's bed, wandering through his favorite places in town, or repeating expressions and phrases that were his, not mine. My parents noticed, too. They would give me worried looks when I used words or expressions that felt foreign to me but familiar to them, remnants of Bogdan surfacing through me. I kept my left eye covered, even though I'd checked it countless times when alone, confirming that my vision was fine. I could see perfectly, yet I couldn't reconcile its new color with anything I could understand. I had no plan for how to deal with it, just as I had no plan for the other challenges I faced. I was supposed to reintegrate, to move on, but how could I, with this haunting shift in my own identity? I convinced myself that returning to work would be a helpful distraction. Perhaps I needed something to pull me from my thoughts, something that demanded my focus elsewhere. But when I attempted to return to my old job, I found that the company had closed. The war had devoured industries like mine, and work in my field was nearly impossible to find, with the entire country's resources bent toward the war effort. Through my parents' connections, I managed to secure a job as a quality engineer at a munitions factory. But while I had once been a well-regarded engineer, here, I struggled constantly. I made mistake after mistake, my focus slipping like sand through my fingers. The only reason they kept me on was the shortage of staff and a certain deference they held toward me, a hero returned from the front, carrying the weight of war. But the truth was that I was failing not because of a lack of focus, but because I could no longer relate to the structure, the pretenses, and the artificiality I saw everywhere around me. Life on the front changes people. The men I lived with, the ones who fought by my side, lived each second knowing it might be their last. In that space, people reveal themselves entirely. There's no room for pretense, for social games, for the empty conversations that form the fabric of civilian life. Every interaction had been stripped down to its barest purpose, every relationship raw, built on survival and trust. But here, in civilian life, I found none of that. I could see right through people's words, their petty concerns and unspoken fears, the thin facades they used to navigate this society. I found it almost intolerable. I'd grown accustomed to a world where people were true, facing life and death with honesty, knowing that only genuine bonds could keep us alive. Here, my inability to play along, to pretend, made me an outsider. I grew short-tempered, easily provoked, constantly in conflict with colleagues who seemed more interested in appearances than in reality. I could feel their resentment, their distrust building. I had become, to them, an enemy, a reminder of a reality they wanted no part of. Few weeks later, the aftermath of Stalingrad cast a dark shadow over the entire country. News of the Romanian army's defeat swept through the streets, sparking a wave of propaganda-driven events aimed at rallying men to the front lines. Across the country, rallies were organized, meant to inspire patriotism and valor. My parents, my employer, even acquaintances began urging me to attend these events, pressuring me to speak as someone who had served with honor, a hero returned from the front. They wanted words about duty and courage, speeches to stoke pride and incite men to enlist. But each request felt like a weight pressing down on me, suffocating me. I refused, time and again, avoiding the gatherings and rejecting their appeals. I had nothing to offer them, certainly not words about heroism. Then, 2 weeks after the defeat, another blow struck. Word arrived that my brother had been killed. I could barely process the news before grief took hold, a black wave that swallowed everything. My parents were devastated, shattered in a way that words couldn't capture. Yet for me, the news felt like it had shattered whatever fragile walls I'd built to keep myself together. It was as though every painful memory I'd tried to bury came flooding back, each one bringing with it a new and overwhelming loneliness. Bogdan was gone, and now Augustine, the last connection I had to someone who understood the terror of the front lines, was gone too. With his death, the isolation I felt solidified. I knew then that no one around me, no one left in my life, could ever truly understand. I was a stranger among my own people, an outsider trapped in a world that seemed oblivious to the scars I carried. That night, I disappeared. I drifted through the streets, swallowed by my own grief, and when I finally returned home 3 days later, I had no memory of where I'd been. I was exhausted, hollow. The next day, I somehow summoned the strength to return to work, hoping that perhaps routine might steady me, give me some fragile hold on reality. But as I arrived at the factory, I was met with an unexpected scene. Every worker was gathered in the main hall. An event was underway, one of the recruiting rallies meant to inspire more men to enlist. The director of the factory stood on stage, droning on about duty and honor, his words grating against my raw nerves. I hadn't known this event was scheduled, having been gone the past 3 days, and I found myself trapped in the middle of the crowd before I realized what was happening. I turned to leave, hoping to slip out unnoticed, but then I heard my name. I looked up, stunned, as the director pointed at me. "And here we have a true hero," he announced, his voice echoing through the hall. "Someone who has seen the front lines, fought bravely, and returned to us with stories of courage." A wave of nausea hit me as I felt every eye in the room turn toward me, expectant and eager. The director motioned for me to join him on stage, a smile on his face as he called for me to share a few words about heroism. The irony of it was unbearable. The words he wanted, the story he expected, I couldn't give it to him. I stood there, frozen, my mind teetering between anger and despair. How could I speak of heroism when all I knew was the terror, the grief, the senseless loss? What could I say to people who saw me as some symbol, a figure to idolize, when the reality was so much darker, so unspeakably different? The director's introduction ended, and for a moment, the factory hall erupted in cheers, led by those who hadn't yet been on the receiving end of my confrontations. I stood there, gripped by a profound silence, uncertain of how to start, my mind reeling. Then, the recent news of my brother's death surged forward, and words began to pour from me, unfiltered, raw, cutting through the cheers like a knife. I'd like to thank the director for giving me the chance to talk about heroism and for considering me a hero, I began, my voice steady but strained. I'm happy to see that our society is so focused on creating heroes. But I have to wonder, where are these heroes on the front lines? I never met them there. I met brothers, fathers, husbands, even sisters. I never once heard a fellow soldier call himself a hero. They were just people, sons, fathers, loved ones. Is it only back here at home that we forget what we're sending our loved ones to? I paused, sensing a shift in the crowd's energy, as people leaned forward, their attention sharpened. Maybe some of them were like me, cowards, just trying to survive another day, trying to come back to the home they left behind, only to return and find it's no longer the same place they knew. After experiencing the brutal truth of war, surrounded by people who could no longer lie or play games, how are we supposed to return to a world full of fakeness, full of endless social games? I felt the words gathering momentum, my voice rising as I continued. You think you can be heroes? Why didn't you stop the war from happening, then? Why do we need a country that produces heroes instead of a country that doesn't need any? The room was hushed, the cheers silenced, and I felt my voice trembling with rage, bitterness, and truth. We had our chance to defend our territories, to fight for what's ours. And instead, we accepted the cowardice of letting our land be divided, then turned around to fight on behalf of those who divided it. What kind of heroism is that? How can we call ourselves heroes? The director's face had turned pale, his hand gesturing frantically to the technicians to cut the microphone, but the words kept spilling out, my voice cracking as I felt everything unravel. Oh, and the irony is that some of the people you think of as heroes might actually be worthless. If you don't believe me, then maybe you should know I killed my best friend during the war. It doesn't matter that it was an accident, a mistake, I have to live with that truth for the rest of my life. The microphone went silent, too late to stop the ripple of shock and anger that swept through the crowd. I could see the mix of emotions, some people were frozen, caught off guard, while others looked furious, voices rising, demanding answers, demanding retribution. Before I knew what was happening, hands grabbed my arms, and the authorities on site forced me down from the stage and into the back of a police car. I sat there, numb, all the energy draining from me as the magnitude of what I'd done settled in. I had exposed everything, the truth, the shame, the unbearable contradictions of a life torn by war. That night, I was dragged before the military police. I explained the truth as best I could, describing how Bogdan's death had been an accident, a mistake in the chaos of battle. But my words at the factory had come with a heavy price. The authorities, pressured from above, deemed me a threat, a danger to morale, and decided to hold me in jail until a trial could be arranged. I knew, as soon as they led me to the cell, that I was in for a long wait. The nation was crumbling under the strain of a war that was turning against us, and cases like mine, small, inconvenient truths in a country grasping at control, would remain buried under the weight of a system with no time for a disgraced soldier's confession. Chapter 4: Refuge of Simplicity. Finally, some silence. Strange to think that peace can come in such unexpected forms and places. Life has a way of giving us exactly what we need in the least likely ways, and at that moment, all I needed was simplicity, life stripped of demands, expectations, complexities. Prison life offered exactly that. From the first day, I felt no urgency to change my circumstances, no gnawing need to prove myself innocent. Despite my family's desperate attempts to help and protest my confinement, I found myself at ease, as though I had been granted a space to simply exist, uninterrupted. My treatment was humane, a stroke of luck, I suppose. The food was just enough to get by, and the conditions were far better than what I'd endured on the front lines. It was strange, but the simplicity of this life felt like a relief. For the first time since the war, I could breathe without the weight of unspoken truths pressing down on me, truths I had finally released in my confession. And then, a few months into my confinement, came an unexpected visit, Ekaterina. She had heard about my confession and wanted to know the details of what had really happened. Her presence brought a quiet tension, far different from our first encounter after my return from the war. She listened, and though I could feel the weight of every word between us, her manner was calm, searching rather than accusatory. Before she left, she asked to see my left eye, as if she were searching for a piece of Bogdan in me. She then gently inquired if it was I who'd left the ring at her door after my previous visit. The meeting was brief, but heavy. It was hard to know whether this exchange would help either of us move forward or merely keep us tethered to a past too painful to reconcile. Yet her visits continued over the next 3 years. Each time, we shared fragments of ourselves, pieces of memory, grief, and perhaps, forgiveness. In the outside world, time was racing forward, the country plunged into turmoil as it joined the Allies, turning against Germany. Each day brought news of bombings, political upheaval, economic collapse. The whole nation seemed to be spiraling, but I remained untouched by it all. My simple life, confined though it was, became a refuge from a world I could no longer recognize. But as with all things, this quiet would not last. Soon enough, the outside world began to reach me, like cracks forming in a still pond, shattering the temporary peace I had found. By 1946, the prison had become crowded, filled with political prisoners caught in the power shifts of a nation still reeling from the war. The government had turned its focus inward, conducting a relentless purge of its political enemies. In the midst of this, my case was pushed further into the shadows, just one more insignificant file buried under a mountain of priorities. I'd already been in prison for 3 years, mostly keeping to myself as inmates came and went, the turnover so rapid that I barely remembered anyone's name. Then, one winter day in December, I was told I'd be receiving a visitor. Expecting it to be either my parents or Ekaterina, I waited without much thought. But something felt different as the guards led me not to the usual visitors' area, but to a private room, dimly lit and cold, with only a table and 2 chairs in the center. They refused to answer when I asked who was visiting, simply securing my hands and legs to the table, leaving me facing forward. My pulse quickened as I heard the door open behind me. The visitor greeted me by name, his voice strangely familiar, yet I couldn't immediately place it. Then he walked into view, sitting in the chair opposite me, a faint smile crossing his face as he observed my surprise. Recognition struck me, and a rush of questions flooded my mind. It was Ekaterina's brother, a man I had only met briefly in the past when Bogdan was alive. We'd exchanged a few words on those occasions, nothing more. I couldn't fathom why he'd come to see me now. He started by acknowledging the oddity of our meeting and then began a monologue about his own experiences in prison, mentioning his early affiliations with the small, then radical Romanian Communist Party. His demeanor was calm, as if we were having a casual conversation, but his words hung heavily in the air. The tide had turned, he said, and those who had once been the hunted were now the hunters. I sat in silence, struggling to connect his story with my own situation. Eventually, I interrupted, my impatience getting the better of me. "I appreciate your story," I said, trying to sound respectful despite my frustration. "But I can't see what any of this has to do with me. I live a simple life here, cut off from everything outside. None of that concerns me." He smiled slightly, a glint of something unreadable in his eyes. "Soon, it will concern you," he replied. "One way or another, your case must be resolved. And, I believe, you may be a valuable help to me and my friends." His words lingered in the air, a vague and unsettling promise. I felt my pulse quicken, a prickling sense of unease. "Valuable help?" I repeated, frowning in confusion. As I stammered out fragments of laughter, he cut me off with a sudden command. "Take off the patch over your left eye." A chill ran down my spine. The command was too specific, too deliberate. I shook my head instinctively, my hand moving protectively to cover the patch, but he was faster, reaching across the table and lifting it himself before I could react. The movement was swift, leaving me momentarily stunned. He stared at my left eye, his face slowly breaking into a look of satisfaction, his suspicions apparently confirmed. I felt exposed, as though something within me had been laid bare. Once again, I found myself speechless, words caught somewhere between disbelief and helplessness. It seemed that years in prison had dulled my ability to defend myself, even in conversation. Before I could gather my thoughts, he began speaking again, his tone infused with a confidence and satisfaction that set my nerves on edge. He explained, with a twisted sense of pride, that he'd learned about our meeting from Ekaterina, how I'd returned from the war, the strange changes I'd undergone, and the visit she had paid me over the past few years. He mentioned 2 things in particular that had piqued his interest, my left eye, with its altered color, and the ring I had left at her door. He had apparently looked into my life, prying into details I hadn't even considered unusual, piecing together my erratic behaviors and disappearances from what he'd learned through Ekaterina, my parents, and others. "You visited Bogdan's parents, slept in his bed, drifted around town visiting places he loved, even places you supposedly hated, he continued, his eyes gleaming with a peculiar satisfaction. Your parents noticed, too, your strange speech, your habits, and your tendency to disappear for days. His voice lowered, each word falling with a kind of eerie finality. All of it points to one possibility. He paused, letting the silence settle, before delivering his conclusion with chilling clarity. He had developed a theory that I had somehow begun to take on the behaviors and memories of the friend I'd killed, as if his spirit were reflected in me. And even more unbelievable, he thought the physical change of my left eye to Bogdan's color was evidence that something impossible was taking place, a transference of sorts, beyond the bounds of reason. I stared at him, stunned. His theory sounded too absurd to consider. I couldn't hold back a burst of laughter, making it clear I thought it was madness. My reaction visibly irritated him, but he didn't reply immediately. Instead, he stepped back, his eyes cold, and picked up a folder of papers from the table. Walking to the door, he stopped just before leaving and, with unsettling calm, delivered his parting words. I know my theory sounds far-fetched, he said, watching me intently. But you'd better hope it's true. Otherwise, you'll have no value to me, and that makes your future very uncertain. He paused, allowing his words to settle. And if you're not interested in protecting yourself, maybe you'll care more about your parents. He mentioned, almost casually, that evidence was being gathered implicating them in activities deemed oppositional to the Communist Party, a claim that carried consequences I could barely bring myself to imagine. My heart raced as I called out, asking him to clarify, but he merely smiled, satisfied with my alarm. You'll have a chance soon enough to show me that this theory has some truth to it, he said before closing the door behind him. For your sake, it'd better be true. The alternative won't be one you'll like. The door shut with a resounding click, leaving me alone in the silent room, his words echoing in my mind like a taunt, his threat weaving a web of dread around my thoughts. It seemed my quiet, unassuming life in prison was destined to be shattered again, this time by forces far beyond my control. The worst part was that I had no idea how Claudiu, Ekaterina's brother, intended to test his theory, if he even needed to. Thinking over our conversation, it struck me that he didn't want to test it at all. He was certain of his theory, convinced it would work, his only question was whether I was willing to accept it, or perhaps, capable of cooperating. It was a chilling realization, to think that someone had seen through me so clearly, deciphering something I had barely recognized myself. The thought that I might actually be assuming the memories, behaviors, and thoughts of those I had killed was too strange, too absurd to process, and yet, how could I deny it? Since my return from the war, there had been dreams that felt foreign, expressions and feelings that surfaced unbidden. Preferences I'd once despised now felt familiar, comfortable even. How could I have lived with these fragments for so long without fully understanding what they were? This revelation opened the floodgates of my mind, and suddenly, I was drowning in questions, a torrent of doubt surging through my thoughts in the silent stillness of my cell. Had I truly been in denial all this time, quietly ignoring signs that should have been impossible to miss? And if so, how much control did I actually have over this transformation? Was I merely affected by fragments of the people I'd killed, or did these pieces slowly consume me, replacing what was me bit by bit? The question spiraled. When these memories, these mannerisms from others took hold, was it partial, or did it slowly become a complete takeover? And if so, how long would it take before I was no longer myself at all? What if, by some twist of fate, I were to kill multiple people? Would I lose myself entirely, my identity erased and replaced by countless fragments of others? For weeks, these questions plagued me. My cell, once a haven of calm, had transformed into a cage where my own thoughts clawed at me from the inside. I was caught in a cycle, tormented by questions that I couldn't answer, trapped in a mystery as unknowable as it was terrifying. Claudiu had been right about one thing, he'd left me with no choice but to confront myself, whether I was ready or not. A sense of betrayal crept into my mind, a new shadow that added to my growing unease. I couldn't shake the thought that Ekaterina's visits, which I had clung to as a source of comfort and forgiveness, may have been orchestrated by her brother, Claudiu. Had her warmth and seeming understanding been genuine, or were they part of some twisted plan? The doubt gnawed at me, leaving me with a bitter feeling that perhaps the forgiveness I'd felt was just an illusion. The worst part was the uncertainty. I had no way of knowing her true intentions. Her visits had stopped entirely after Claudiu's ominous encounter with me, which only deepened my suspicions. On the other hand, my parents still visited regularly, their faces etched with worry each time they saw me. I did my best to assure them that I was well, but beneath our small, guarded exchanges, I sensed their fear. The new government had turned the legal system into a tool for their own ends, with laws as vague and malleable as water. Every day, new arrests were made, and the charges were often unclear, the justifications as twisted as the political situation itself. I could see the anxiety in my parents' eyes, and tried, in the limited time we had together, to ask carefully if there was anything in their lives that could draw the government's attention. But the threat was so nebulous, so deliberately unclear, that it was nearly impossible to gauge what might be a risk. The authorities no longer needed a specific reason to act, they only needed to sense a person's vulnerability. People with no political connections, no influence, like my parents, were at the mercy of those in power, caught in the crosshairs simply because they couldn't defend themselves. The visits with my parents brought a glimmer of normalcy, but each time they left, a familiar dread settled over me. I had no way to protect them, no way to reach out, and my own situation remained uncertain. In these moments, the confines of my cell felt suffocating in a way I hadn't known before, and I was left alone with a gnawing sense of guilt and helplessness, haunted by a future I had no power to alter. A few weeks had passed in silence since Claudiu's last visit, and I had started to hope that perhaps his interest had faded. But one night, after the final count and as I was preparing to sleep, 2 guards appeared at my cell door. They instructed me to put on my shoes. I glanced at them, immediately wary, and began to ask questions, but they brushed me off politely, saying only that I'd been requested. Their tone was respectful, even friendly, but this only deepened my sense of unease as they led me down the dim hallway. They brought me to the guards' lockers, and as I stepped inside, panic surged, my mind racing through the worst possibilities. But to my confusion, they simply handed me a set of plain civilian clothes. While I dressed, one of the guards mentioned, almost casually, that a car was ready and asked if I could hurry. Their odd politeness unsettled me even more as they escorted me to the waiting car outside the prison, shielding my head between the building and the vehicle, keeping my hands cuffed until I was seated. Once inside, they removed the cuffs, assuring me there was no need for restraints. When I asked where we were going, they only smiled and told me I'd find out soon enough, adding that there was no reason to worry. If it were an execution, one said with a grin, you'd know it. Their high spirits and casual chatter were disconcerting, their questions about my time in prison sounding more like attempts to keep me distracted. I could feel a sense of practiced ease in their tone, as if their cheerfulness was meant to mask something much darker. The car journey stretched on for what felt like 15 or 20 minutes before it finally stopped. I was guided out, my eyes still covered, and led into a building, down a series of stairs. The air grew colder as we descended, thick with a silence that seemed to swallow even the muffled sounds of our footsteps. Finally, they removed the cover from my eyes, and I found myself staring directly into Claudiu's calm, calculating face. By this point, I had already guessed that he was behind all of this, that he would be waiting for me. As I took in the surroundings, a dimly lit basement room, sparse but functional, I knew this was the moment he'd been waiting for, the moment he'd finally test his theory. Claudiu wasted no time on pleasantries. So, this is the moment, he said, gesturing toward the dimly lit center of the room. My eyes adjusted, and I saw the figure of a man tied to a chair, his head covered by a dark cloth sack, his body slumped and motionless. Claudiu's voice was cold, direct. I want names from him. I don't care how you get them. Alive or dead, you can get what I need either way. He sounded disturbingly sure of himself, confident in my abilities even as I tried to stammer out a protest, telling him that I wasn't even certain I could do what he imagined. But he ignored me entirely, a grim certainty in his eyes as he looked at me. "Think about your family," he said, his voice laced with an unmistakable threat. Then he turned to the guards, nodding for them to leave. He walked out last, closing the door behind him and leaving me in cold silence. I took a deep breath, trying to keep calm, but panic rose in me almost instantly. The plan I clung to, weak though it was to convince the man to give up the names himself. That way, we both might survive this nightmare. But doubt swirled. What if he refused? What if I had to kill him? And if Claudiu's theory was true, if taking his life meant absorbing his memories, then Claudiu would come to me again, demanding I repeat this sick ritual. I felt trapped, my mind spiraling with each agonizing thought. Desperate, I considered the possibility of lying, of claiming that the memories hadn't transferred. But as my mind raced, I became aware of movement, a faint stirring from the man bound to the chair. His presence jolted me out of my panicked thoughts, forcing me to focus on the reality before me. Slowly, I walked toward him, my footsteps echoing in the stillness. When I reached him, I gripped the edge of the bag over his head and pulled it off. As his face came into view, the first detail that struck me was his eyes, a color different from my own. If I killed him, and if Claudiu's theory was true, the change would be obvious. There would be no way to lie about it. The panic swelled again, and I stood there, my mind a battlefield of desperate options, my heart pounding as I faced the impossible choice before me. In a burst of desperation, I leaned forward, trying to convince the man to give me the names. "You can get out of here alive," I insisted, my voice strained. "Give me what they want, and you can go home, be with your family." But he laughed bitterly, spitting at the floor in disgust. It was clear he'd been through interrogations before and didn't believe a word of my offer. He shook his head slowly, his voice low with resignation. "The only way I'm getting home tonight is if someone finally ends this. Just finish it." Claudiu's countdown echoed in my mind, pressing on me like a weight, compressing time into what felt like seconds. I circled around the chair, glancing to a corner of the room where a table held an assortment of tools, chains, a pair of brass knuckles, and, to my surprise, a pistol. The man's voice became a murmur in the background as my own thoughts began to drown him out. He was right, Claudiu would never let him walk away. What did it matter if it was my hand or someone else's? I tried to rationalize it, telling myself that maybe he deserved it, that maybe the world would be better without him. Gripping the pistol, I felt my mind racing, my body trembling under the weight of an impossible decision. I could barely hear myself think over the barrage of my own thoughts and the pressure mounting with every second. Finally, in a moment of desperate release, I asked him, "Will you tell me the names?" His answer was a firm, unwavering no. The gun fired almost reflexively, the echo of the shot slicing through the air, reverberating off the cold walls. An end, at least. I let the pistol fall from my hand, the metal clattering on the floor, and stared numbly at the lifeless form before me. The door opened almost immediately. Claudiu stood there with the guards, watching me with that calculating expression. The room was silent, and my whole body felt weighted with an emptiness that numbed me to the core. I thought back to Bogdan, an accident. This time, it was by force. And yet, no matter the cause, taking a life would haunt me, each one a new scar on my soul. I didn't move as Claudiu ordered one guard to retrieve the pistol and another to remove the body. Soon after, I was taken upstairs to a dimly lit living room. I sat in silence, my mind spinning between horror, fatigue, and a strange numbness, until Claudiu reappeared, a cigar in one hand. He offered it to me, then poured 2 glasses of whiskey, sliding one across the table. I felt drained, trapped, my thoughts churning between disgust and resignation. I looked up at him and managed to ask, "Can I return to my cell now?" Claudiu only smiled, a hint of satisfaction glinting in his eyes. "Forget about that cell," he said, his voice tinged with finality. "You'll be staying here until you come up with the names." He took a final swig of his drink, leaving me with the guards, who quickly made their intentions clear. This was now my prison, and any attempt to escape would be met with tragic consequences. They showed me to my room, an ordinary space with little to suggest confinement, yet it felt suffocating. My life was now bound to Claudiu's demands, tied to the memories of the man I had killed. Exhausted and trapped, I lay down, wrestling with the bleak realization that the weight of this man's death, and the names hidden in his memories, were all that Claudiu needed to keep me in his grip. That night, as I lay in bed, my mind churned with heavy thoughts about what my life had become and, even more troubling, what kind of future I could possibly expect. As humans, we cling to hope, that vague promise that the future will be better or at least bearable. Without it, the present becomes a suffocating grip that tightens around us, leaving no escape. And in my situation, that grip felt relentless. I searched for anything that could offer me a thread of hope, some assurance that things might improve, but I kept coming up empty-handed. The weight of what I'd done, the trauma of taking another life, and the pressure from Claudiu to produce valuable information were crushing. And yet, deep down, I struggled to even believe in Claudiu's theory about me absorbing others' memories and personalities. Even if it were true, would it comfort me to know that I was slowly losing myself, piece by piece? As I wrestled with these thoughts, lying in the dim room assigned to me, I noticed a strange sensation creeping over me. The room began to lose color, fading into shades of gray, as if the life were slowly draining out of it. Everything became muted, washed out. The next thing I remember was waking up, my wrists bound to the radiator in the living room, with the two guards staring at me. One of them noticed I'd come to and asked, "Who are you?" The question struck me as ridiculous, confusing, and infuriating all at once. I ignored him, demanding to be untied and asking why I'd been bound in the first place. The other guard offered me a glass of water, shaking his head in a mix of surprise and relief. "You're back," he said. "You put on quite a show earlier, you know." "What show?" I asked, the confusion and frustration mounting. The guards exchanged glances, then slowly explained what had happened. They told me I had left my room around 4 a.m., walked down to the basement, and sat in the chair where I'd killed the man earlier that night. For several minutes, I spoke in his voice, answering the very questions I'd asked him during the interrogation, as if I were him. They said it was eerie, as though I were speaking his unspoken thoughts, as if I were him in those final moments. They'd gotten the names they needed from me, but then things took a darker turn. I'd suddenly become aggressive, attempting to harm myself, mirroring what they assumed were the man's last thoughts as he neared the point of death. Their words hung in the air, filling me with a chilling sense of unease. Had I truly taken on this man's memories, his thoughts, even his despair? It was one thing to fear losing myself, but another to realize that I might already be slipping away, becoming a vessel for the lives I'd taken. To the guards, my abilities seemed like something to celebrate, as if I'd been granted some kind of twisted superpower. They encouraged me to see it that way, offering me a drink to toast what they saw as a gift. But I felt no desire to celebrate. There was nothing fortunate about what I was going through. I refused their offer and instead went to find a mirror, peeling off the patch over my left eye to confront what I already suspected. The reflection confirmed it, another new color stared back at me. The weight of this revelation hit me hard, an unbearable question rising in my mind. Did this mean I'd lost Bogdan's memories and personality entirely, replaced by those of the man I'd just killed? Or was I some blend of all three, a fractured mix, my identity slipping further from me with each encounter? Who was I now? I returned to the guards, asking them who the man from the basement had been, desperate to find some anchor, some detail that might answer my spiraling questions. But they refused, stating that they'd been ordered to keep his identity from me. For a moment, I felt the urge to push back, to demand answers, but I held back. Instead, I found myself asking if the offer for a drink was still on the table. They exchanged a glance and nodded, their tone easygoing and even welcoming as they poured me a glass. Dawn was near, but the night passed in a blur of clinking glasses and conversation, the drinks going down far too easily. For a few brief hours, life seemed almost normal. I could lose myself in the simplicity of small talk and laughter, forgetting the horrors that clung to me, if only for a moment. By the time the first light of morning began to filter in, I could barely stand, my legs unsteady, and the guards helped me back to my room. For those 2 or 3 hours, I'd felt like any other man, sharing drinks and banter. It wasn't an act, somehow, it had felt genuine. I sank into a deep sleep, the first real rest I'd had in what felt like years. When I finally woke, it was late afternoon, and I found Claudiu standing over me, his presence a chilling reminder that whatever sense of normalcy I'd felt was probably only temporary. Claudiu greeted my wary expression with a laugh, glancing around as if amused by my disturbed state. "I hear there was a little celebration last night, without me," he said, not bothering to hide his grin. "But don't worry. I'm glad for you. I'm always happy when my partners are doing well. I take care of my partners." "Partners?" I sighed, the word catching in my throat. "Let's be honest, Claudiu. I'm not your partner, I'm just a tool. I'm living this insignificant life, just waiting to be used whenever you or people in power decide to play God." I braced myself, wondering if I'd gone too far, if this was crossing some invisible line. But the feeling of fear faded, replaced by a wave of indifference. I felt as though, for once, I had nothing left to lose. Claudiu didn't flinch, merely listening with a calm that unnerved me. When he finally spoke, there was a cool, almost reassuring tone to his words. "You're smart, and you'll understand how things stand soon enough. I don't just need a tool," he said, emphasizing each word carefully. "I need someone I can trust, someone I can work with, especially in these times of paranoia, lies, and betrayals." He leaned forward, his tone shifting to something darker, more serious. "You might only have one real option here, one path forward. But it's a good path, one that others would give anything you want." He then told me to get ready, saying I should meet him downstairs in 30 minutes. As he left, one of the guards entered, setting new clothes and a bottle of cologne on the bed. "Feeling all right?" he asked, his tone surprisingly friendly. I mumbled something in response, still feeling the remnants of my hangover but, strangely, in better spirits. For the first time in days, my mind felt light, free from the weight of yesterday's relentless thoughts. I washed and dressed quickly, the effects of last night's haze lingering just enough to soften the edges of my doubts. For now, I was content to follow orders, my mind floating in a rare state of clarity, like I was completely aware about how messed up is everything in my life right now, but I had some clarity about it and some promises of better times and less pressure at least. I was ready in less than 20 minutes, dressed in a suit finer than anything I'd owned, the red tie sharp, the scent of an expensive cologne unfamiliar and surreal. It was hard to believe that only 24 hours ago, I'd been a prisoner. Now, here I was, dressed as a man of importance, a figure perhaps even respectable. The sharp contrasts made everything feel unreal, as if I were simply watching someone else's life unfold. Outside, Claudiu was waiting in the car, his expression bemused as I slid in beside him. I half joked, "It's going to look a bit strange returning to jail dressed like this, don't you think?" The comment sent him, the guards, and the driver into fits of laughter. "Ah, don't worry about the jail," he said, grinning. "You won't be seeing that place again." As we drove through the city, I caught glimpses of the wreckage from the recent bombings. Despite the ruins, there were still people on the streets, children playing, young men and women moving with a determination to rebuild, as though the city's heartbeat was sustained by those untouched by despair. Claudiu watched me taking it all in and didn't interrupt, even as I felt compelled to apologize for my wide-eyed fascination with such simple sights. He only nodded, saying he understood completely. He, too, had spent time in prison, released into freedom with new eyes and a fresh appreciation for the smallest, most ordinary things. There were layers to Claudiu that I hadn't considered, and as we talked, I realized there were more commonalities between us than I'd first imagined. We stopped at a restaurant where, surrounded by good food, drinks, and casual conversation, I almost forgot about the dark web I'd been caught in. Yet throughout the night, moments of discomfort would flash through me. Claudiu's charm felt too smooth, his ideas either too manipulative or completely contradictory to mine, and I'd catch myself feeling disgust or anger toward him. But then, just as suddenly, Sabin Bogdan Codarcea. The feelings would pass, replaced by a strange calm that let me carry on as though nothing had happened. As the night wore on, Claudiu mentioned that I'd be staying at the house with the guards for a little more time, promising to set things in motion to restore my status, reinventing me as a war hero. I could hardly believe his confidence, how seamlessly he painted a picture of my future, even offering to provide me with a new home at one point and a fresh start, whatever I wanted. Despite my mistrust, I couldn't deny the warmth of hope sparked by his words, however hollow it might be. Claudiu even encouraged me to think about what I wanted to do going forward, assuring me he'd arrange everything once I decided. When I expressed my concerns, explaining that I'd need time to adjust, he seemed to understand. Then I added that I had a request: I needed to know more about the people whose memories I was absorbing, their identities, and their stories. If he truly saw me as a partner, I said, he would grant me that much. Claudiu hesitated for a moment, a flicker of something unreadable in his gaze. I pressed on, explaining that knowing more about them might help me cope with their memories and personalities. After a moment of silence, he agreed, saying he'd instruct the guards to share details about last night's victim. It was late, and as we parted, Claudiu shook my hand with a grin, promising we'd meet again soon, perhaps for another feast or for more serious tasks. Back in the car, the guards drove me back to the house, where the effects of the drinks and the evening's strange comforts weighed on me. All I wanted was sleep, but soon enough, I found myself awake in the living room, sharing drinks with the guards once again. For a moment, I wondered if the day had been a dream and I'd simply returned to the strange night before. But I was in my new clothes, proof of the surreal events that had unfolded. After several more rounds of drinks, I brought up Claudiu's promise, explaining that he'd granted permission to tell me about the man I'd killed. The guard shared a knowing smile. "Good," one of them said. "Maybe now you'll understand why you're enjoying the drinks." They were tipsy, the liquor loosening their tongues as they spoke of last night's victim, a hard drinker, fiercely loyal, and brave to a fault. But as they described him, I noticed something unsettling: they despised him for his loyalty and courage, qualities that should have been seen as virtues. Instead, they admired him only for his vices, his bitterness and recklessness, his disregard for consequence. For a moment, I felt like the world had turned upside down. It was as if everything good had become something to scorn, while the worst parts of human nature were celebrated. And who was I to judge? I'd given up on holding myself to any standards, lost in the tides of survival, detached from values I'd once held close. Going with the flow, chasing any refuge in the numbness of drink or Claudiu's promises, I found myself grasping for anything to provide stability, even if it was the twisted stability of a life stripped of morality. I was becoming someone I no longer recognized, yet I couldn't bring myself to fight it. I had no energy for rebellion, only a vague hope that somehow, something might make it all feel right again. Chapter 5: Familiar Strangers. Over the next few days, I often found myself slipping out of consciousness, dreaming of unfamiliar things or awakening mid-conversation, with no memory of what I'd been saying. The strangeness was concerning but intermittent, as I was myself most of the time. When I tried to piece together the accounts from the guards of what I'd done or said, everything fit the personality and memories of my last victim, not Bogdan's. Strangely, I felt indifferent to the loss of Bogdan's memory, as though part of me had willingly let go. There was a simplicity in that indifference, a calm that softened the edges of my conscience, making everything feel strangely manageable. Some of these new feelings felt foreign, as if inherited from my victim. Yet, they also seemed like parts of me I'd kept buried, a side molded by years of discipline, of striving to live up to values I'd never questioned. Was I, perhaps, a product of circumstance, a blend of what others expected? These darker thoughts felt both alien and uncomfortably familiar, like reflections of something I'd always suspected might be hiding within. My past self, with its moral certainties and ideals, felt distant, an echo that had lost its hold. One nagging sensation, however, was the strange anxiety I felt toward my next encounter with Claudiu. No longer did I fear what he demanded of me, instead, I was anxious for the chance to prove myself, to demonstrate that I could handle whatever he needed. I didn't have to wait long. A week later, the guards came to my room with instructions to meet in the basement. I understood the message immediately and arrived there within a minute. When I entered, I found myself in the middle of a brutal interrogation. A man, someone I didn't recognize, was tied to a chair, his face bruised and bloody from the beating he was enduring. I was directed to a corner, where I stood silently, watching as Claudiu orchestrated the interrogation. Another man, unfamiliar to me, was administering the beating under Claudiu's guidance. The entire scene felt like a deliberate display, a reminder of how easily everything could unravel if I ever fell out of line. But it was more than a threat. Watching the other man, I understood that Claudiu was sending a message: my abilities alone wouldn't make me invaluable, there were others just as willing, just as ruthless. As I watched the man extract all the information Claudiu wanted, I felt the fear of competitiveness. This wasn't my task, after all, and the job was being done without me. When Claudiu had what he needed, he took a gun from the table and shot the man in the chair without a hint of hesitation. Turning to the man who'd performed the interrogation, he praised his work, promising to see him in the car in a moment. Then he turned to me and asked me to wait for him upstairs. I climbed to the room, every step echoing with thoughts, the bitter realization that I was just a pawn in a larger game, my abilities useful but not indispensable. Yet, even as I recognized this, a feeling grew within me, a desire to prove that I could be more than a mere memory thief. When Claudiu entered, I spoke before he could begin, telling him with unexpected resolve that I could do more, that I was willing to handle whatever tasks he needed. I saw a flicker of surprise in his eyes before his face lit with approval. He praised me, calling me a quick learner, someone who could understand things fast, a quality he admired. He put a hand on my shoulder, gesturing for me to lower my voice as he leaned close. "I'll need you to do something small for me," he said in a near whisper. "It may be nothing, but you never know with these things. I need you to watch one of the guards, the one who's usually with you. Let me know if you notice anything suspicious." I nodded, hiding my own surprise, but he seemed satisfied. He straightened, clapping me on the shoulder before mentioning plans for a drink together over the weekend. He'd arrange it all, he assured me, before disappearing into the night. As I watched him go, a strange mix of emotions washed over me. Just when I thought I'd found a kind of footing, however dark, I realized that any hope of stability in this world was a fool's illusion. Here, security was a fleeting illusion, a temporary calm before the next storm. I felt a surge of disappointment, a reminder of my own vulnerability and of how little control I truly had, even as I tried to fool myself into thinking otherwise. I was chasing after illusions in a game I barely understood, and I was beginning to suspect that there was no end, no real refuge, only an endless, weary march into darkness. In the weeks that followed, I found myself slipping deeper into a state of suspicion, a tension winding through my every thought and interaction. I couldn't shake the feeling that every glance, every conversation, hid something more. Claudiu's warning echoed in my mind: you never know with people. The guard I'd been asked to watch was no exception, and I took to simulating my unconscious episodes to study his behavior when he thought I wasn't aware. It was a calculated risk, an experiment to see if he'd let something slip, believing I wasn't watching. One night, after murmuring nonsense and slumping onto the sofa as if exhausted, I kept my eyes half closed and observed as the other guard went to the restroom. Alone, the guard under suspicion approached one of the jackets draped over a chair and quickly rifled through its pockets. He pulled out a slip of paper, scanning it intently before slipping it back just as the other guard returned. I pretended to stir, coming back to consciousness slowly, and soon after joined them for a drink. The guard who'd retrieved his jacket soon stepped outside to smoke, his expression distant. That moment opened my eyes to a reality I hadn't fully grasped. Suspicion wasn't just a task Claudiu assigned to me, it was the unspoken rule that governed everyone. It was clear that each of us was tasked to spy, not only on targets, but also on each other. It was a network of observation, a web of distrust, and I realized that I needed to be vigilant, watching every step and every gesture with care. When I recounted the event to Claudiu, he seemed pleased, even impressed by my subtlety. There was a glint in his eye, a certain satisfaction, and for the first time, I felt I'd earned his trust. It wasn't just a hunch. Over the next few days, everything he'd promised finally began to materialize. My name was cleared, my reputation restored, and my life transformed. Claudiu arranged for me to move to an apartment just a few blocks from his own residence. The place was immaculate, a world away from the dingy rooms I'd known, and it marked a strange transition from a prisoner to someone Claudiu counted on. He introduced me to people in his inner circle, individuals who wielded authority in the country's highest institutions and within the Communist Party, which by now was the only political entity in the country. They were people of influence, each with their own hidden agenda, and I quickly learned that trust was as much a commodity as power. As part of Claudiu's machinations, I was decorated as a war hero, awarded as if in compensation for the injustice of my imprisonment. He even permitted me to reconnect with my family, though he made it clear that I was to keep all details of my work shrouded in secrecy. On paper, I held an official position in the army, a convenient cover that required no real attendance. My actual work, though, was a life of shadows and whispers, collecting information, infiltrating circles, and carefully gaining the trust of those at the highest levels of the state's power games. Each day, the life I'd once known drifted further from my memory, replaced by this new existence where truth was elusive, loyalty was conditional, and trust was a weapon as dangerous as any. The path Claudiu had set me on felt both exhilarating and hollow, a race without an end, where everything was just a momentary illusion. The number of my victims increased rapidly in the following months. Each time, the act itself became easier to bear, a task I could almost perform on autopilot. My sole focus was getting it over with and preparing for the next. When repeated so often, even the darkest acts lose their meaning, their disgust, their shame, and become nothing more than routine. But I began to notice something troubling. With each new victim, the time it took to absorb their memories and traits grew shorter, while the volume of what I absorbed increased. The memories were filling my mind, pushing my unconscious episodes to last longer and happen more frequently. The impact was seeping into my being, and I began to worry, seriously worry, but hid it, fearing that any hint of instability would make me less trustworthy. Then came a night I would never forget. I was upstairs in the house we used for interrogations when I heard noises below, the sounds of a struggle, loud and chaotic. I rushed downstairs, finding Claudiu with a guard I didn't recognize, a fresh cut on his face. Claudiu waved off my concern, telling me to follow him to the basement. I assumed there was another victim, but as we entered, I saw something that sent a chill through me. The guard I'd been asked to watch was tied to the interrogation chair. It took only a moment for me to grasp the reality. Claudiu confirmed my suspicions in his cold, efficient tone. The guard was a traitor, and in our world, there was no mercy for betrayal. I was instructed to take care of it, and with a nod, Claudiu ordered everyone else to leave the room. The door shut behind them, and in the silence, I felt abandoned, left alone with a man I'd known for months, a man with whom I'd shared casual conversations and quiet nights outside, both of us simply existing in this strange, secretive life. He began begging for my help, his voice breaking with desperation. But we both knew the truth. There was no escape for either of us, and I understood in that moment that they didn't need anything from him. They simply wanted him gone, and they wanted me to do it. I glanced at the table, instinctively reaching for a weapon, a gun to end things quickly, but found nothing but some torture instruments. There was always a gun on the table, always. The realization of what is expected from me struck me a moment later, leaving my body paralyzed. They want him gone, but they don't care about his memories or any information he holds. They wanted to push me to another level. They just left me no choice but to draw this out, ensuring the process would be as painful as possible. What followed was a horror that felt detached from reality, an unfair battle between two men, a mental torture endured by both. I was there, but I was also a ghost, watching myself, unable to recognize the person administering this brutal punishment. When it was over, I was hollow, more of a phantom than a man. I'd crossed yet another line, but the question loomed in my mind, was there ever a final line, or was I in a freefall without end? Each time I thought I'd earned Claudiu's full trust, he'd raise the stakes, testing me further. I remembered when he'd first called me a partner, not a tool, but I was beginning to wonder if those words had ever meant anything at all. By now, I'd become an expert at repressing memories, shoving them so deep that I could almost forget them. In truth, my only moments of relief came when I tapped into the happiest memories of my victims. Strange, how I could now admit it to myself, I was feeding on them, indulging in a kind of twisted, shameful vampirism, draining their joy to survive my own horror. That night changed something in me. I thought I'd lost myself completely, unable to remember anything that came before I'd begun working for Claudiu. My life felt drained of substance, even as the material things I'd acquired, comforts and luxuries, piled up around me. They meant nothing. Once again, I saw no path forward, no purpose, no hope for anything better. I was a shadow, a sad and broken madman clinging to the stolen memories of strangers, hoping my next victim would have something worth holding onto, a spark of joy that might sustain me in this grim, endless void. Chapter 6. Come and see. In the days following the incident with the guard, I became keenly aware of the reactions of those around me. Outwardly, they all despised his betrayal, condemning him with a loyalty that appeared absolute. But I couldn't shake the sense that, beneath their displays of outrage, there was an undercurrent of fear of becoming the next target. We were all part of a system where appearances were everything, and anything less than unwavering allegiance could lead to a fate similar to that of my last victim. I'd always understood this on some level, but now, it was as though every glance and every word held a second meaning, a subtle edge that reminded me of how precarious loyalty really was. This time, however, something was different. My latest victim was someone I'd known, someone I'd shared time with, and the impact was unsettling. In the days that followed, I experienced increasingly frequent unconscious episodes, each bringing forth memories that were both familiar and alien. Through his eyes, I saw myself, the way I moved, the way I spoke, the way I'd been just another face in his life. There was a strange, gut-wrenching discomfort in these memories, a sense of alienation from my own reflection. I hated the person I saw, the tone of my voice, the gestures that felt foreign and hollow. I became consumed by these visions, haunted by my own image as seen through another's eyes. Sleep was nearly impossible, my mind choked by a version of myself I barely recognized. For the first time, I asked Claudiu for a favor. I requested a victim who had never known me. He listened, and by the end of the week, I had a new target, someone who came with none of the personal familiarity that had so disturbed me. The process continued, month after month, and then years. Over time, I gained a fearsome reputation as the regime's most trusted, and most feared, torturer, a secret weapon Claudiu relied on with the utmost confidence. My work became known in high places, my story even reaching the upper ranks of the Soviet Union. I was sent on special assignments, tasked with extracting memories from scientists, spies, foreign dignitaries, anyone whose knowledge held value for those in power. It became a numb routine, a repetitive, hollow cycle. Yet, with each new victim, I assimilated their memories and personalities faster, until I found myself desperate for new victims, new memories. The person that I was before faded, replaced by fragments of others, blending and dissolving. Some days, I would find myself torturing my victims with a detached sense of duty, other times, I'd weep before them, feeling their fear and sorrow as if it were my own. I no longer knew which emotions were mine and which were remnants of those I had consumed. I could not distinguish between the torment of others and the residue of my own fading conscience. More than 15 years passed like this, one life bleeding into the next. I became a hollow shell, the person I'd been completely lost in the tides of stolen memories and borrowed pain. And then? One evening in November, I arrived at my parents' apartment for dinner, as I had done 2 or 3 times each week for as long as I could remember. No matter what darkness filled my life, these evenings with my parents were a sanctuary, a brief return to normalcy where I could set aside the reality of my work and remember who I was before it all. My parents remained unaware of the shadow work I did, and I kept it that way, sheltering the close relationship we'd always shared. Yet, that night felt different from the moment I walked in the door. My parents, usually so warm and welcoming, seemed uneasy, their cheerful masks slipping to reveal worry, a weight hanging in the air that neither seemed willing to address. I tried to give them space, allowing room for whatever it was they needed to say, but the dinner stretched on in small talk, neither one saying anything that hinted at their worry. It wasn't until we'd nearly finished eating that I could no longer hold back my own questions. I asked gently if everything was all right. At first, my mother shook her head, smiling faintly, but I could see the strain in her expression. She wanted to pretend everything was fine, perhaps believing she could keep whatever it was at bay a little longer. But my father's face grew somber. He set his fork down, sighed deeply, and looked directly at me with eyes that seemed older, sadder, than I'd ever seen them. "You'll find out sooner or later," he said, his voice steady but tinged with resignation. And then he put it as simply as he could: he was suffering from a disease that couldn't be cured, and the doctors had given him no more than 6 months. In all my years, in all the time I'd spent dealing with death, inflicting it, watching it, feeling its nearness, I'd never felt the kind of quiet devastation that washed over me then. I'd grown numb to the suffering of strangers, become almost inhuman in the face of others' pain, but nothing could numb me to this. This was my father, a man whose life and love had formed the best parts of me, even as I buried those parts deeper over the years. In that moment, I realized just how unprepared I was to face his suffering, to face losing him. The rest of the evening passed in a haze of promises and half-hearted reassurances. I told them I'd arrange for the best doctors in the country, that I'd appeal to everyone I knew. My father nodded, smiling as if indulging me, but I saw the acceptance in his eyes, an acceptance that cut me deeply. He had more life in him than hope, and I could feel his resignation settle over me like a shadow. Still, I couldn't let go of the need to try. I couldn't let him go without a fight. The following day, I called in every favor, appealed to every connection I had, and by nightfall, the best doctors were by his side, offering him every ounce of knowledge and care. But the prognosis didn't change. Every doctor, every expert gave the same grim prediction. So, over the next few weeks, I became divided, constantly drifting between thoughts of his impending death and memories of what he had been for me, how he'd shaped the person I once was. These thoughts were often interrupted by the unconscious episodes that had become as much a part of my life as my own shadow. It was as though life was mocking me, letting me exist in borrowed memories while my own were slipping away. My father's health deteriorated faster than the doctors had predicted. Within a month, he was confined to the hospital, unable to live on his own. I visited him every evening, always meeting with my mother before we'd go to his room together. I tried to support her as best as I could, her grief reflecting my own, a pain we shared without speaking. Then one night, when I arrived at the hospital, the doctors met me with grim faces. His condition had taken a severe turn. He'd had multiple seizures throughout the day and was now barely conscious. They allowed me to see him, cautioning me that he might not be able to respond, though my mother hadn't arrived yet. I went in alone, and after a few minutes of silence by his bedside, he stirred. He opened his eyes, and each word he spoke seemed to pull from him with agonizing effort, his voice strained and weak. He told me how proud he was of me, how he'd been proud of my brother, and how it pained him to leave me and my mother alone. And then, his words grew softer, sadder. He would soon be with my brother, he said, and in that moment, I saw the acceptance in his eyes that had been there all along. He asked me to take care of my mother, to make sure she had the support she needed. But then his voice took on a new edge, a desperation I hadn't heard before. His eyes filled with tears, and he begged me to end his suffering, to let him die with dignity, without prolonging his pain. I was frozen, my heart caught in my chest, struggling to breathe as he repeated his plea, the weight of it bearing down on me. But he saw the refusal in my eyes, the inability to respond to what he'd asked. Moments later, he slipped back into unconsciousness, seconds before my mother entered the room. She found me in a state of shock, my mind reeling from the intensity of his words, but I quickly gathered myself, pretending that nothing had happened. I excused myself, offering to get her a cup of tea, and left the room. That night, I didn't sleep. The silence seemed to press in on me from every direction, and his words echoed in my mind. I thought of all the lives I'd taken, all the deaths I'd caused without hesitation, and yet I couldn't fathom ending my father's suffering. It was as though life itself was testing me, breaking me, pushing me to cross a line I could hardly even consider. And so, I refused, night after night, lingering in that silence, drifting in and out of tortured thoughts. But in the end, I did it. I returned to his room days later, my mind made up, though it felt as though I were moving through a nightmare, watching myself from afar. He was unconscious, unaware of my presence, and as I stood there, I told myself it was mercy, an act of love. I was honoring his last wish. I took his hand gently, steeling myself as I pulled the syringe from my pocket. A doctor I trusted had helped me prepare it, ensuring it would be painless, swift. And then, before I could think twice, I injected the liquid into his vein, my hand shaking as I forced myself to hold on. Time slowed to an unbearable crawl, each second weighted with the finality of what I was doing. I removed the syringe, but before I could step back, his eyes opened. I saw him, truly saw him, one last time. And in that instant, I felt as though I'd collided with something vast and immovable, an impact that shattered the last fragments of myself. It felt like hitting a wall at the speed of light, a collision so intense that nothing remained. And then, nothing. Memories flooded me, but they weren't mine. This time, everything felt different. They were his memories, my father's, unfolding one by one, tracing back from the final moments of his life to the years we shared. In vivid clarity, I saw myself through his eyes, his pride, his love, his hope, and it was unbearable. The scenes unfolded in reverse, memories of me standing at his bedside as I gave him the final injection, then rewinding further, to dinners together, shared conversations, to years before the war. I saw myself as he'd seen me, as the son he'd been proud of, the son he believed in. Then came memories from my younger years, my time in university, then college, then back to primary school. Finally, I was a child in his eyes, the image moving backward through each cherished moment. And then, the last memory. His rushing into a hospital, his footsteps echoing down the corridor as he races to a specific room. He knocks softly, opening the door with the utmost care. The room is dimly lit, and a voice inside speaks gently, "Come and see." He steps closer, his eyes falling upon my mother cradling a newborn, me. I felt his overwhelming joy, his heart swelling as he took in the sight of his child for the first time, all the love and hope he felt in that instant. And as I watched this moment unfold, my own heart filled with an acute, overwhelming pain that woke me, tearing me from the memory. I woke up still in the hospital, crying uncontrollably, feeling a sense of despair unlike anything I had ever known. The nurses put me on a bed, administering medications to help with what they thought was shock and grief. But they couldn't know what I'd just experienced, couldn't fathom that I had seen his memories. The one image stayed with me, fixed in my mind, the look in his eyes as he saw me minutes after I was born, the joy and hope he felt, dreams for a future that would ultimately collide with the life I'd come to live. Nothing could pull me from that image, and with each passing moment, my shame grew unbearable. I saw the person he thought I would become, a son he would have been proud of, a son I once was, before the war twisted everything. I had been that person, I believed it myself, until the war shattered me and dragged me into a world of unending chaos, where survival meant destroying everything I'd been. I became a man who inflicted pain, who lived in the shadows of others' memories, who lost any semblance of humanity to fit into an ever-worsening cycle of terror and desperation. Leaving the hospital that night, I went straight to my apartment, feeling hollow, fractured beyond repair. My mother had chosen to stay with my father's body, and I found myself completely alone. In the empty silence, the weight of all I'd become bore down on me. I entered my apartment, collapsing to the floor in tears, feeling the overwhelming need to rid myself of the vision of my father's joy, to be freed from seeing anything, ever again. I went to the bathroom, seized by the madness of my own grief, and poured an entire bottle of bleach over my eyes. I pressed my fists into my face, feeling the burn, welcoming the searing pain. My tears flowed, mixing with the chemicals, and I smashed my head against the sink, the walls, anything within reach, desperate to drown out my vision, to block out everything I'd seen. I wanted to live in the darkness, to be left alone with those memories and shut out the world that had taken everything from me. They found me 2 days later, collapsed on my apartment floor, my sight gone, my mind hollowed out. The heating had been off, the room chilled, my body limp and unresponsive, and they thought I was dead. I'd laid there for 2 days, shivering in the cold, trying to cling to my father's memories, to live in the fragments of a life I no longer had. The ambulance took me in, the doctors confirming I'd permanently lost my sight, that I would never see again. Psychiatrist after psychiatrist tried to pry answers from me, but I had none left to give. They diagnosed me, labeled me, and eventually deemed me unfit to live outside of institutional care. And so, here I remain, a hollow shell, blind and bound in darkness, trapped within the walls of this mental institution. You found me here now, as I invited you to come and see inside me. Not just to witness the sum of my actions, but to understand the world that shaped them, the world that pushed me, relentlessly, toward every line I crossed. I am not here to justify or absolve myself, my sins are woven into my being, inseparable from the person I've become. But I ask you to look beyond my deeds, to see the hollowed spaces where my own choices ended and the demands of a brutal, chaotic world took over. This isn't a plea for forgiveness. I know there is none for what I've done. I am here to warn you, to help you glimpse the weight of a world in which we are made to shed our humanity piece by piece, in which survival demands sacrifices we can't take back. I am only one person, but I am part of a much larger story, a cycle where lives, identities, and even memories are stripped down to mere tools. I lived in a world that crafted me, that asked of me things I could never truly say no, and that now leaves me here, a ghost bound by the remnants of others. Do not repeat. Not my actions, but the world that shaped these actions, do not repeat it. Guard yourselves against it. There is nothing for you here, in this world, only a warning in the darkness, to seek out your own path, to refuse the pull of a life where choices are illusions and humanity is bartered for survival.